So, as Philip mentioned, I'm an assistant professor here in our Department of Global Studies. I'm spending this year in Beijing, where I'm a visiting assistant professor. And I really look forward to, here it is. Sounds much stronger and better now. I really look forward to coming back to California and working with you folks. So today I am very quickly going to introduce just what I mean by global political ecology and what it is to take a critical view of geopolitics. And I'm very quickly going to give you a contextual background on soy and global agro-industrial restructuring. After that, I want to make two main arguments. First, I want to look at the argument that Brazilian exports to China, specifically Brazilian soybean exports, are normally treated as an issue of comparative advantage. Brazil has so much land per capita, China doesn't, so it's natural that Brazil would export these land-intensive products to China. I'm going to denaturalize that argument and show that it's not quite that way. And then I'm going to also unbunk the myth that because China is so dependent on buying soybeans from Brazil, that China is also a major investor in Brazilian farmland, as usually treated in a more negative terms of being a land grabber in Brazil. I'm going to show that that's actually an extremely xenophobic argument that has a long history, a sedimented, layered history of xenophobia, and that actually, if we want to understand why, where, and how Chinese investments occur in Brazilian agribusiness, we have to understand the dynamics of resistance there, as well as the much broader set of investments, specifically in infrastructure for trade, like ports, waterways, and such. So all my slides are going to be available to you online. The talk is also going to be made available, so please don't get caught up trying to snap pictures of the slides or taking too many notes. There's a lot of material. I talk very fast, so hold on to your hats, get on the edge of your seat, and just come along, okay? Let's begin with this. What is this? What's going on here? The temperature. The polar vortex that has just swooped over this continent. A lot of people talk about this, as people talk about different types of natural disasters and natural effects. Is this natural or human-made? Human, natural. Climate change. Good. These things really matter. Of course, variations in weather and in climate patterns occur naturally, but because of anthropogenic climate change, the frequency, the intensity of these weather events is, of course, happening a lot more. And by the way, it's not just whether this happens, but what's the effect of this? Extreme weather. What is it like if you're in Chicago? Really cold. Now think about it. What is it like if you're homeless in Chicago? Deadly. Meanwhile, if one of your 7 homes is in Chicago, where do you think these people were on, say, January 29th, when the weather was below 50 there, negative 50? They were probably not in their Chicago apartment, right, in penthouse. They were probably in one of their other homes. Not so deadly. And what do we do about this? How is it that you deal with homeless shelters in a situation of extreme event? How is it that you deal with mitigating or adapting to conditions of climate change, which are going to see increasingly deadly weather like this elsewhere? It's not just a matter of what do we do in Chicago. Deforestation in Brazil, industrialization in China are major factors that may or may not be aggravating phenomena such as this. So when I talk about global political ecology, what I'm trying to get you to think about is that environmental issues are always political. And political issues are also always environmental. You cannot deal with an environmental issue just as a technical thing, as a natural thing. And you cannot deal with any political question like homelessness without thinking about the fact that homelessness, exposure to the environment, really matters when the environment is changing radically. I'll teach a whole course in global political ecology. And what you're going to get here is just a taste using the case studies from my research of what global political ecology looks like as a framework. What about geopolitics? What's geopolitics? Has anyone heard this term? Raise your hand if you've heard this term. Some people have heard this term. There's no geography department at UC Irvine, but there are geographers, and some of us, like me and Professor Al-Balushi in global studies. So what is geopolitics? The one there in the middle, raise your hand.
I did.
Yes.
So it's politics that's usually influenced by geography, placement of a political group in a certain land. So a lot of people recently have been talking about East Asian geopolitics, especially with China, Korea, Japan, and like the Senkaku Islands. That's geopolitics.
Great. So it's the connection of both geography and politics, and it's often talked about like this in terms of regional context, in terms of different countries, conflicts between countries. So the Senkaku Islands is a geopolitical issue, not because those tiny islands in themselves are special, but because you have these huge nations coming into conflict over who controls them, and so forth and so on. Classic geopolitics is both very environmentally determinist. It's very much about how the geography determines politics, and it's also very focused on nation states. The idea that certain nation states have interests that will either align or conflict with other nation states. That's what geopolitics looks like in a lot of political science departments. That's what geopolitics looks like in a lot of old-timey geography departments. But critical geopolitics takes, like the colleague there was saying, a little deeper lens in this and realizes that it's not just that how geography determines politics, but how politics and space are constantly co-producing each other, and how these are occurring across scales. So the Senkaku Islands, again, to take the example that the colleague mentioned, it's not just that place in relation to different nation states, but what about people who live there, or who migrate to there, or migrate from there? Questions of refugees, of citizenship, are questions that are related to nation states, but are also, in a way, oblique to it. You can look at geopolitics as global politics in a way that, as we do in the Department of Global Studies, sees the global occurring in a whole spectrum, where the classroom where we are now is itself part of various different types of networks and systems and ways of thinking that connect globally. So when I talk about critical geopolitics, what I'm talking about is the real life dynamics of global capitalism and grounded social ecological resistance. And I'm foregrounding capitalism and resistance because capitalism, as if you take my global political economy course in the fall, you'll learn, is basically the dominant political economic system of the globe. And yet it's a system that is imbued with deep contradictions, inherent contradictions, that make friction, social friction, environmental friction, resistance, a key formative factor of it. So critical geopolitics is, I'm not going to talk about Brazil and China as monolithic things. I'm not going to talk about this at the nation state level. I'm not going to say China wants this, China wants food imports, Brazil wants to export soy. I'm going to see who are the actors, where are they acting, how are they interacting with each other. I'm going to try and bring it down to the level of real human beings in real places. And not just how nation states interact, but how these different classes, different companies, different individuals with different interests either align or come into conflict with one another. That's what I'll be trying to do with this talk. Now, to give you a little background on soy and global agri-industrial restructuring. Why soy? Soybean really matters. And I'm sorry to do this to you. Brace yourselves. This guy. I promise this is the only time that he's coming up, okay? But this is a really good example, since we are based in this country, to talk about why it matters and why you should pay attention to this talk about China, Brazil, and agri-industrial trade and investments. This picture was taken in Iowa in July 26th of this past year, when the trade war was really effectively taking place, and soybean farmers in the US were starting to face the brunt of it. The United States had been, for the past century, a major food power in the world, a major exporter. US agribusiness was not only massive for domestic production and domestic politics, but was also a massive instrument of US foreign power. And now, with the trade war, what happened is that soybeans are the #1 export to China. In 2016, it was already over 13 billion. 2017, it was even higher than that. But with the trade war, basically China imposed counter tariffs on top US exports to China, top among them being soybeans. And with a 25% tariff on top of US soybeans, guess what? US soybeans were way too expensive compared to soybeans that they could buy elsewhere. And what happened is that basically the US farm sector, specifically the soybean sector, suffered a huge price drop. Farmers were risking bankruptcy. In fact, this guy held this press conference to announce that he was going to scrounge for $12 billion of direct subsidies for these farmers so that they don't go broke. And this past week, they made the last disbursement. Over $7.3 billion have already been paid to US soy farmers just to make up for the lost market in China. Now, the US was a major power. If you look at this share of global soy exports, during the 60s and 70s, basically the entire global market for soybeans, all international trade in soybeans came out of the US. If the trade war had happened back in the 70s, it would have been impossible for a country like China to stop buying US soybeans. But that's no longer the case. This data, I'm sorry, is pretty old, but you can already see that the US was brought to less than half. The current numbers, the US is responsible for about 1/3 of the international market. Brazil alone is responsible for the other third. So when the US basically had the door shut by the Chinese market on its soybean exports, it did not matter because Chinese buyers were able to turn to Brazil and basically fulfill their quota. This has been a massive transformation of the global political economic landscape. This is soy production by continent. You notice that North America was the largest producer up until the early 2000s. But South America has shot up drastically, extremely fast. Most of this line here in South America is Brazil, to a smaller extent Argentina, and a few other countries even less so. Notice also that after North America, which is basically US and lesser extent Canada, and South America, all other countries are pretty insignificant in terms of soybean production. If you look at soybean exports, it's even more clear how South America has surpassed North America to become the largest exporting region of soy in the world. And the flip side is this. Europe used to be the largest buyer of soybeans well into the 90s, but basically around 2000, East Asia not only surpassed, but skyrocketed as the largest buyer of soybeans. Most of this is China. Japan accounted for most of East Asian imports during this period, and it continues to import. Korea also imports, Vietnam, but by far, the lion's share of this is China. So this really is a story of Brazilian soybean exports to China, radically transforming global political economy and creating a new circumstance, a new condition for what that is. And this is not just about the trade, as the trade war shows, this is also going to have deep political implications domestically and transnationally. That's the intro. Now, we're going to move into the particular arguments. The economists term this comparative advantage. Anyone in economics major here can explain to us what's comparative advantage? No economics majors? Really?
We're all international studies.
Really? That's great. I thought that there was going to be a lot. Yeah, please.
Comparative advantage, if I'm recalling my economics correctly, is when it's not absolute, so it's not I completely dominate the production, but I make enough to be more effective at making it than, say, the other or the partner.
Yes.
Yeah, comparative advantage is making whatever it is you're the best at. Whatever your country is capable of, that's what you make.
Exactly. Exactly. The idea that a place like Brazil has a lot of land, has a lot of agribusiness, has a lot of expertise. It can be very good at producing soybeans, even outpacing the US, so we should focus on that. Meanwhile, China, where the argument goes, there's too many people, there's not enough land, they don't have the convention to do it, they shouldn't do soybeans. They should focus on assembling manufacturing and so forth and so on. The idea is that Brazil-China agro-industrial trade is natural because Brazil looks like this. This is a soybean farm in Brazil, a big one. They don't usually use all these tractors at the same time. They line this up to look cool for the picture. By the way, now they're very embarrassed of this picture, and agribusiness lobbyists in Brazil hide this picture. Although back in the early 2000s, they were proud of this because this picture shows absolutely no trees.
Deforestation in the Amazon.
We're going to get to that. Meanwhile, Happy Lunar New Year to all of you. I just came back from China. I was spending Lunar New Year there. The idea is that China has so many people, it should focus on labor-intensive production. Comparative advantage in labor-intensive manufacturing, and they should outsource soybean exports. In a New Year meal like this, you're going to eat a lot of food. So the idea is also that China needs to import a lot of this because there's so many people. Right? Who's heard this type of argument before? Raise your hand. A few of you. The rest of you are not so awake yet. Sorry, it's late afternoon. I'm going to try to argue that it's not so much just the number of people, and it's not just the type of comparative advantage, but it's a much more specific process of political economic transformation that's been taking place. And it has a lot more to do with industrialization than it has to do with natural availabilities or the predisposition of an economy for any other reason. This, I want to argue, is intimately connected to this, not only by trade, by the way in which these production systems actually have been politically constructed. This, by the way, is a pork disassembling plant. So let's get to that. Deforestation in the Amazon. One major thing that I want to convey to you is that not only there's a cost to this production of soy in Brazil and to the way that the soy is consumed in China, but that this is not natural, that this is very specifically politically constructed. And the deforestation of the Amazon, like was already raised, is normally how this is understood. This is northern Brazil. The green is standing vegetation. The red is deforested areas. However, this is not really where soy expansion is taking place. As a matter of fact, it's more to do with the way that deforestation is being avoided here. If you remember, if you look back to these graphs that I showed you, really it's in the 2000s that the boom of Brazilian soy to China begins. And if you look at what's been happening with deforestation in the Amazon in the 2000s, you're going to notice that deforestation has fallen dramatically to its lowest points in modern history. So the conventional argument that soybean expansion in Brazil to feed people in China is driving deforestation in Amazon is very quickly debunked. And a lot of the agribusinesses actually point to this and they say, actually, no, look at that. The intensification of soy production has actually been sparing the need to expand into the forest. However, the green lines here are deforestation in the Amazon during the 2000s. The orange is deforestation in the Cerrado. While deforestation in the Amazon has indeed fallen during the period of the soy boom, deforestation in the Cerrado has mushroomed instead. This is the Cerrado region of Brazil. It covers a quarter of the territory of the country. And that is exactly where the soybean expansion has taken place. Soy began in the south of the country and expanded into the central region of the Cerrado. I'm not going to be talking much about Argentina, Paraguay, Bolivia, Uruguay, where soy has also expanded, but I'm happy to take questions about that if any of you have any special interests in those countries. But in effect, what you've had is that the whole political milieu, the whole political strategy of we have to save the Amazon has protected the Amazon, but at the cost of sacrificing the Cerrado. I wrote a whole paper about this with a colleague of mine at UCLA called Sacred Groves, Sacrifice Zones in Soy Production. It wasn't the one that was assigned for you, but if you're very interested in these questions of deforestation specifically, that's where you could go for a more fleshed out version of this argument. The Cerrado is considered a natural, has a natural aptitude for soy production because it's considered, quote, empty and flat, easy to mechanize. So if Brazil has a comparative advantage in making soy production, it's because it has a place like the Cerrado, which is, quote unquote, empty and, easy to be put into this kind of production. This is a highly flawed narrative. The Cerrado is, first, not just an empty place. It is a remarkably complex ecosystem. This is one of the few areas that's remaining without too much disturbance. It's a national park. Because it's a little more mountainous, it was protected in that way and less useful for agribusiness. But it's a place with extreme biodiversity. It's the most biodiverse savanna type areas in the world. It's the type of diversity that's also highly integrated with migratory birds and species, for example, the Amazon. So if you sacrifice the Cerrado, a lot of species that live part-time in the Cerrado and then go to the Amazon they're going to lose their nesting grounds. So you also lose ecosystem services and biodiversity elsewhere. It's an extremely important place for water, and I'll come back to water later on. It's in the central highlands of the country. It effectively functions like a sponge that captures rainfall and as a water tower that then takes that rainfall and forms the basin of some of the largest rivers in not just South America, but the world. The entire São Francisco River basin that I'll talk about later on has its headwaters here, as well as a huge portion of the Paraguay-Plata basin, as well as much of the southern portion of the Amazon basin, of the Araguaia-Tocantins rivers. They all originate in the Cerrado. And this area still has remarkable social diversity as well. Not only indigenous peoples that have been historically there for millennia, but also lots of communities of quilombolas, of self-liberated Maroons, people that were brought as, enslaved into South America and freed themselves, as well as various traditional communities that live on using the natural resources of the Cerrado and various different types of peasant communities. It's an area with huge agricultural potential. In fact, during the 18th and 19th century, when Portuguese Brazilian explorers were getting to the region, they remarked at how wealthy it was in terms of water resources, in terms of plants and fruits and vegetables, and of how well it could be used for that. So the idea that's produced that the Cerrado is empty, that the soils are poor, that there was nothing there, that we might as well just plant it all over with soy, actually rewrites this entire history of abundance of the place to justify this. Half of the Cerrado has already been deforested, and about 30% of the rest is highly degraded. This is what it looked like in around 1900. This is what it looked like in the beginning of that soy boom. We've already come 17 years further into that. Most of this area here that's still green has already been deforested in the last 17 years. Just for you to look at this once again. Now I'm going to zoom in this tiny little area here. This is the headwaters of the Araguaia River. This area here is exactly the main springs. And this was when a national park was created right there. The orange is deforestation. This is 73, 89, 2001. This is the projection for 2030. I'm going to go through it once again for you to see. And when we talk about deforestation, we're not just talking about the displacement of trees and vegetation. Taking a political ecology approach, we always have to look at social ecology. This is the displacement of not just vegetation, but displacement of people. This is the number of families that have been forcibly displaced off their land. During the 80s, you had some of the boom of soy production in these areas of the Cerrado. This is mostly displacement due to soy expansion. Here also, this is mostly due to soy consolidation of agribusiness. These areas, sugarcane, mining, this is timber plantations. But this displacement of people is mostly soy expansion. And even in 2006, This is the area that I'm going to zoom in later to talk to you about. The displacement of people is dramatic. And it's not just people being forced off the land and trees being cut down. It's not what gets removed. It's also what gets left behind. Soybean production, like most other agro-industrial production, is extremely toxic. The amount of herbicides, pesticides, and even chemical fertilizers used would blow your mind if you're able to wrap your head around it. And this use of agrochemicals has very serious health effects. This is a study from Paraguay with an indigenous community. Of the 291 families involved in the study, only 22% did not report any sickness. That is, about almost 80% of the people in this community reported sickness, chronic symptoms of intoxication. That is, not just from one instance of intoxication, but something that's sustained through a long period of their life. Almost 60% of people have constant headaches and migraines. Almost a third of them suffer from constant intoxication and have symptoms like vomiting, stomach aches. A quarter of them. Even in terms of severe intoxication, most of this is because they use airplanes to throw the agrochemicals on the farms, and then these little airplanes will sometimes fly directly over the community, or guess what? Wind will drift the pesticide over into their communities. And chronic intoxication, not only you have 28% of the people immediately after having vomiting, 16% dizziness, but even causing blindness and death. Now, the political process of constructing this was not without resistance. You say, well, why did people just, sit idly by while they were being forced off the land, poisoned, and having their ecosystem destroyed? Well, this was a geopolitical, intentional process of the Brazilian state to basically settle what was considered those empty lands and set up commercial agriculture. The hope was to set up agribusiness to set up internal stability, to stabilize the countryside, stop basically peasant uprisings, increase foreign exchange by exporting crops, use that exchange to finance industrialization, and integrate those quote-unquote empty spaces into the industrialized economy of the coast. And also, by settling further inland, guarantee the borders of Brazil from those geopolitical enemies of neighboring countries that might want to take a piece of your territory. And you got to remember that this area was bought off from Peru. A lot of this area had wars with Bolivia, and of course Paraguay in the middle of the 19th century was almost decimated by Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay. So these military leaders had these histories in mind as they were basically forcing the relocation of people and setting up agribusiness in the region. And that was not done without resistance. During this period, basically from the 30s into the 70s, you had very strong peasant movements in Brazil, very strong communist party in Brazil, and they organized huge strikes, especially among sugarcane cutters in the northeast of the region, and there were even armed peasant uprisings in the south and in the central regions of Brazil. And this very strong peasant movement, this very strong communist movement, effectively forced the democratically elected government of Brazil in the early 60s to declare, okay, we will do land redistribution, we will do agrarian reform. We will enable, instead of peasants just being forced off the land, we will enable people to get land. However, 14 days after the government declared agrarian reform, the military intervened, forced the democratically elected president out, and installed a 25-year military dictatorship. Tanks on the street. Immediately, over 3,000 people, especially communist organizers and peasant movement leaders, were imprisoned. Many of them were tortured, assassinated, many others forced into exile. Agrarian reform that was declared 13 days before was never really implemented. So the process of establishing a major soybean agribusiness production system in Brazil is not just because it has the natural conditions for it. It's not just because it has the technological capacity. It's not just because it has the know-how. It's because it was a politically constructed project despite the environmental cost, despite the social cost. So knowing that history, look back at this. 1986 is towards the end of the military dictatorship, and you still had this much displacement. 2006 is after the dictatorship. This is during the democratic period. This is even during the Workers' Party-led government. Even when Lula, the Workers' Party president, was in office, you still had intensive displacement of people exactly where you had soybean exports kind of taking root, soybean production for export taking root. This area here is where I'm going to talk about, because that's where the most famous Chinese investment has taken place. That's what that region looks like. This is a town. This is a small city. For you to have a sense of the scale of what I'm talking about, of the farms there. The round circles are central pivot irrigation systems. Here's another county a little further south. This is the highway. This is from an airplane instead of a satellite. This is all within one farm. This is a road where a car will go through. These are huge, huge production systems, and they require a huge amount of water. For you to have a sense, so here's Bahia State. We're talking about this western Bahia State. Here's where the top of the highlands are. The light color is deforested soy plantations. And then basically it goes further down, 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 down towards the river basin here. So a lot of rainfall here. This is the headwaters of a lot of rivers, and they go down. That's why you have a lot of soy farms here and fewer as you go further down into this dry area. Here again is western Bahia State. This is rainfall. The more blue, the more rain. The more red, the less rain. Underneath this area here, this is a subsoil. This is a geological map. This light green is the Araguaia aquifer. It's one of the largest aquifers in the world. It's one of the largest resources. It's one of the largest places of freshwater resource in the world. It's not just about land. You need water to produce. And Brazil has a lot of it, but like I said, it's not just it has the resource, therefore that generates a comparative advantage. It's how then that gets politically used and implemented. This is the São Francisco River. It's one of the largest rivers in Brazil. This is the basin. This picture, this bridge, goes roughly around where that line is. So we're about halfway through this river. In 2015, the drought was so intense that you could literally walk across the river. If you look at the bridge, this is where the water normally is. Frequently, it goes up to here. And you can see how low it was. This drought, unfortunately, is not an anomaly. Now this is becoming a new normal. And this type of climate change is not just because of carbon emissions. This is also because the deforestation of the Cerrado for planting soybeans is transforming how that ecosystem operates hydrologically. You no longer have the water falling here, seeping into the underground and feeding these small rivers that feed that São Francisco River. All of this water either gets just immediately, it just runs off, so you have floods during the rainy season, or it gets captured by the crops themselves and then exported out. So you don't have as much water actually seeping into the soil, replenishing the Araguaia aquifer, and having the aquifer then replenish those rivers year-round. These rivers are dying. Every year, about 8 to 10 of these rivers this size are drying up and not coming back. And the communities that have lived there historically would set up their shacks in the river valley where they would plant a little bit of manioc, a little bit of corn, a little bit of, fruits and veggies, and then they would take their cattle up to the highlands. So here's the lowlands and here's the highlands. So here, there was no private property title. People would use that land in common as pastures. So because they didn't have private property title there, they could not protect their claims for those common pastures when the state, especially during the military dictatorship, was enabling, financing, and promoting the expansion of agribusiness in these regions. So these communities that would historically graze their cattle on these highlands and had done so relatively sustainably for at least 300 or 400 years now have been completely forced out. And this drawing made by community members shows you that the struggle is not just about land, it's about water. It's about the agribusiness production system, the agri-industrial production system, sucking up their water, draining it all out, and taking it for export. So here is a case that happened last fall. One of these farms that was using a lot of these irrigation pumps to take up a lot of that water and basically drying up the entire community around it and downstream, was then attacked by these communities. They occupied the farm, they set fire to the pump. They basically tried to disable and force the agribusiness company out. And of course, the company then resorted to extremely violent repression, hiring private gunmen to not only get those people out, but then to try and keep them out. So this type of conflict, land conflict, water conflict, these politically constructed conflicts throughout decades, and the intensification of them is what then has brought this guy. Jair Bolsonaro. Who's Jair Bolsonaro? Let's hear from someone else. You're a great participant.
Extremely right actor.
Extreme right
Politician.
politician. And what is this extreme right politician now? President of Brazil. He's like the Brazilian Trump. He might be worse than Trump. One of the major things in his platform has been talking about the need to loosen regulations on police so they can crack down more, and also empower landowners to shoot to kill anyone who dares challenge their properties. He's praised the military dictatorship. He demonizes landless peasants. He has named the largest peasant movement in Brazil a terrorist organization, which not only forecloses their ability to operate NGOs and this and that, but actually enables the government to arrest them or just kill them off. He is extremely racist, especially complaining against black and indigenous peoples, whose ability to have territorial claims now has been removed from agencies, from government agencies that have worked historically with those communities and put in the hands of the Ministry of Agriculture, which is entirely dominated by agribusiness and agribusiness interests. He's promising even more environmental deregulation, despite catastrophes like the bursting of the dam in Brazil earlier this month that has killed over 100 people and poisoned hundreds of thousands of hectares and killed another river, after another dam burst a couple of years ago. So all of that are the political conditions that have created this so-called comparative advantage for Brazil to make piles of soybean. It's not a natural condition, it's not an economic aptitude, it's a political decision to do so. And the flip side of that is, of course, imports of soybean to China. Now let's switch back over to China. This is a line of Chinese soy production. These are imports. What you'll notice is that in the late 90s, early 2000s, basically imports spiked. But that's not because production collapsed. Actually, production was increasing, continued to somewhat increase, or at most stabilized. So it's not that China stopped producing soybeans. If you look at here, 2000 to 2010, you notice domestic production has basically been stable. What has increased are imports. So what you have to understand is not that China is unable to produce or that they stopped producing, is that they started to need a lot more and to supplement production with imports, specifically for processing. The red line here is the proportion of processing that comes from domestic supplies, and the blue are the processed soybeans that come from imports. What you'll notice is that from the late 90s until, this is 2010, but this has continued the tendency. Basically, all processed soybeans in China have come from imports, while they use the domestics for other reasons. Who knows what the domestic soybeans might be used for? The unprocessed soybeans. Someone different, yeah.
I read for question for producing byproducts like oil, like what is soybean oil?
That's when you process the soybean, then you get the meal and the oil. Those are the two main components of the processed. Right. Yes?
Say food additives and fillers? Maybe?
A lot of those additives and fillers are made from the oils or from the meals. They're further processed. They're another step after just the crushing. But you're right about food. Yes?
Is it cattle feed?
That's what the meal is used for. That's actual food. Yes, in the back. Tofu. Exactly. Tofu as the main soy food, or other soy foods, or just boiling the beans, or eating like edamame. That's the Japanese name. So when humans eat the soybean, they don't have to be crushed for oil or meal first and then reworked into soy processing. So mostly Chinese, their own domestic production is mostly what they actually eat as human food. Everything else goes into these things that y'all have talked about. That's what goes into livestock feed. This is the real reason. It's not that there's too many people in China. It's not that they don't have the capacity to produce soybeans or even more of it. It's that the way that pork production is taking place has changed dramatically. The red line is backyard production. That's the peasant household with one little pig or two, up to 5, where every family would have their own pig. That pig would eat the leftover food from the household. They would eat the leftover, stuff from the crops that they would farm. And that pig would poop, and that poop was organic fertilizer. Free organic fertilizer. That's how pork production had taken place in China for thousands and thousands of years. Extremely sustainably. The green line is specialized household production. These are households that would produce more pigs than they would consume for themselves. Instead of producing 1, 2, or 3, they would produce 30, 40, up to 50 pigs. But it's still at a kind of family labor, it's still relatively small scale. The blue line, large-scale commercial production, that's factory farms. That's like what you'd have here in the US. Huge warehouses with lots and lots of pigs. So what you're going to see here is that during the quote, reform and opening up, during the capitalist restoration in China, peasant production, which accounted for almost the entire production of pork, has radically collapsed. At first, you had some households specializing in pork production, but much more recently what you've had is the takeoff of industrial, large-scale, concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs. The dotted lines are projections. But right now, we're already at the point where the peasant household production is down to about 5%. And the other two are almost at 50-50. But with the regulations in place now, the projection is that it's basically almost 70% or more are going to become just industrial feed operations. In the meantime, the idea that there is no land in China is quite complicated. It's true that if you look at farmland availability per capita, it's lower than the global average. It's far lower than Brazil. But you also have a lot of places in China like this. This is a village near Xishuangbanna in southern China. This is a mountainous area. This is an ethnic minority area. This is an area that's considered poor and underdeveloped. And the village was completely abandoned, including its fields. These people they were basically relocated to newer housing complexes in a nearby township. But their farmland is basically abandoned. You have a lot, especially in mountainous areas, a lot of farmland that's being abandoned. That doesn't mean that, it's not that, there's too much land in China. It's not that they don't have a loss of land. There's a lot of loss of land, especially near urban areas. Urban expansion is dramatically reducing, especially high quality and market accessible farmland. But there's still also a lot of farmland that's also being unused. Here is what I want you to take home to understand why China is importing so many soybeans. It's not there's too many people and not enough land. Let's begin with urbanization. There was a political decision there, starting in the late 70s and early 80s, to push for industrialization, export-oriented industrialization, focused on large urban centers in the coast. So with this concentration of people in the cities for these new factories, the concentration of industrial labor, you actually were left with insufficient labor in the countryside. All the working age population is basically moving to the cities. And in the countryside, you have what they call hollow villages with left behind populations. Left behind elders who cannot go work in the new factories, left behind children who are too young to work, and a lot of left behind women who are there to farm, to take care of those elders, and to take care of those children. So you lost a lot of the labor force that could do the labor-intensive integration of raising a little pork, little pig, together with your crops. That crop livestock integration, which is labor-intensive, very sustainable, but labor-intensive, was being abandoned. And as you abandon that integration of crop and livestock, As you abandon the household production of pigs, you start to depend on the farm on imported fertilizers and the imported soy, because now you got to feed these huge warehouses chock full of pigs who cannot just survive on farm scraps and leftovers. They really need industrial feed. And as you've turned agriculture and livestock production in China dependent on these imported inputs, on these industrialized inputs, guess what? The cost of production has increased. And now these are also on competition with international markets. The imported fertilizer, the imported feed, the price that the farmers get when they try to market their crops are now having to be competing with highly industrialized producers in US, Brazil, Chile, elsewhere. And as the cost of production increase, you have falling agricultural incomes. And when the income from farming falls, what do you have? More and more people leaving the countryside, rural exodus, searching for higher paying urban employment. And as you have more and more people leaving the countryside to try and get higher wages in the cities, we are back where we began, and this cycle becomes a spiral. This is about labor. This is about industrialization. At no point in this cycle we need to make any reference to insufficiency of farmland, to too many people. This is about the capitalist restoration in China. This is about export-oriented industrialization. And this is about the sacrifice zone of those hollowed villages in order to build up those sacred world factories. Chinese soy imports have to do more with this type of overpopulation than with human overpopulation, because all these pigs require the industrialized feed. And when you have all these pigs also concentrated in this place, what do you get? Instead of their poop being nice, healthy, free organic fertilizer, that actually becomes the largest, the number one factor of water pollution in China. According to the Chinese own Ministry of Environment and Ministry of Land and Resources, pig excrement is by far the largest source of pollution for waters in China. This is in Sichuan province. This is a river next to one of these industrial pork feeding operations, one of these pig factory farms. This green algae effectively kills everything in the river because they're not able to breathe. The algae use up all the oxygen and leave nothing just but extra nitrogen in it. And it's not just the poop that's pollution. When you have so many pigs concentrated in a single huge warehouse, what happens if one pig gets sick? They all get sick. In 2013, there was a really high-profile case because about 16,000 dead pigs showed up floating across the beautiful Shanghai Pudong waterway. Really hard to hide 16,000 dead pigs floating across one of the world's largest and most fancy cities. But this was just one case that got really high profile. But this type of thing is endemic to this type of production system. It's not because it's in China. This happens in Brazil, this happens in the US. Over there, it's happening a lot more and a lot faster because of the way that the pace that this has been taking place. But I don't want to talk about dead pigs in general. Let's talk about this specific dead pig. This picture from January 4th of this year was taken actually in a beach in Jinmen Island, which is technically part of the Kuomintang-controlled territory of Taiwan. And this was not just any other dead pig. This was a diplomatic incident, because now you had dead pigs from the mainland starting to possibly infect the herd in Taiwan. And if you know anything about China and Taiwan, that's a very sensitive issue. In fact, this pig is one of over 650,000 pigs that have died just since about August of 2018. This has been one of the worst outbreaks of swine flu. There's been over 102 confirmed outbreaks across 23 provinces of China. This data is a month old. This has increased even since. Now, this problem is not just, because, it just naturally happens. This is a consequence of the way the pork is being produced. And actually, this particular incident was aggravated by the trade war, specifically. Why? Remember the story that China used to import a lot of soybeans from the US, but then they stopped? Brazilian soybeans, even though it's a lot, can only make up so much. They needed another source of protein for livestock feed. So what they did is that they actually started to grind up dead pigs, use their blood as a source of protein for other pigs. So what you had is that once the swine flu epidemic began, before they could actually stop, in September, they prohibited, only in September of 2018, they prohibited the use of food waste and pig blood as raw material for the production of feed for pigs. But by then, not only was it already too late, but also a lot of factories didn't stop that because they were no longer having cheap enough soybean meal, rich in protein, to put in livestock feed. So they continued into, this is Christmas Day. On Christmas Day, a factory in Tianjin was found to have been still using pig's blood. So they were feeding diseased pigs to other pigs, increasing thereby the epidemic. The epidemic is, I'm trying to show you, politically constructed all the way from the architecture in which pigs live to the global political economy of the trade war. And how could this be stopped? What would be a reverse cycle through that downward spiral that I showed you of labor and industrialization and concentration of people? It's simple. If you have more agroecological crop livestock production integrated, I'm not saying we go back to ancient times. You can have modern technology, you can have modern cooperatives, you can have, a reconstruction of an agroecologically integrated crop and livestock production system that would produce diversified and more resilient agricultural incomes. Because the farmer doesn't depend just on one crop. And if the price of that crop fails, the whole year fails. And you reduce your costs of production, because now you can use your organic-free poop. If you have increasing diversified production, you have more income that can be reinvested into social services at the township and village level. And if you're reinvesting in that township and village economy, you can have more desirable and sustainable rural livelihoods. Instead of exploiting the countryside to drive urbanization and industrialization, if you're actually investing in the countryside, making people enjoy and want to live in the countryside, that will enable even more people to increase agroecological production, to reintegrate more labor-intensive forms of production. This can be a virtuous spiral. This is not new. This is not radical. How are we doing with time? 5. I'm not going to be able to talk about investments at all. Let's just stay on this part here. This is known. In 2005, kind of like the IPCC, the big UN study about climate change, they modeled on that. They made a huge study with 900 scientists for over 100 countries. They all came together to talk about, okay, what do we know about agriculture, science, and technology? What do we know about rural development? And they made a state-of-the-art report that basically says we need is to have agroecology, agrarian reform, and food sovereignty. It's not that we don't have knowledge about how to do this or what to be done. It's known. But it was not politically interesting. The United States, Australia, and the UK, I believe, were the only 3 countries that did not ratify this report. And basically, the World Bank refuses to acknowledge it. The media refuses to talk about it. It's known. It's not lack of knowledge. It's not that we just need more education. It's known. What we need is diversified farming systems. But how do we get there? We got to fight for it. And the people fighting for it are the ones that Bolsonaro is calling terrorists. There is no shortage of food or capacity to physically produce enough food to feed adequately the current and foreseeable population globally. But we don't live globally. We don't have to increase yields. We don't have to produce more food. Too much food goes to waste. We have to change how we produce. I would be talking about, had I had more time, about the Chinese investments. The idea that China is a major land grabber in Brazil. Since I have 4 minutes left, I'm going to just tell you what some of the highlights of that story. China is not actually a major investor. If you look at the area of soy production, it is a major the largest buyer of Brazilian products, and that's where you get back to this guy. He argues, much like Trump, that China is buying up Brazil, that they are taking over our land and resources, that they're a threat to be stopped, and that anti-China rhetoric was a lot of the part of his rhetoric to get elected. And China did become a major investor, and recently the number of investments increased, but they really started in 2010. If you look not just at the number, but at the value, 2010 was when this really started. And that was largely following on a spike of food prices, together with the global financial crisis. And with the spike in food prices, you had a lot of food riots. And a lot of countries that depend a lot on imports, like China, got really scared and started to really try to invest abroad to guarantee their food supply. This was the time that the BRICS was created, but this was exactly the time also that people in Brazil started to talk about, oh my God, China already bought up Africa and is trying to come and buy up Brazil. This rhetoric really took off in 2010, and the guy is just reusing it now, even though it's actually totally not based on fact. If you look at foreign investments in Brazilian agriculture from 2010 to 13, when the Chinese land grab was the biggest headlines in Brazil, China was way down here. Compare it with the United States. Way by far, the United States, Western Europe. If you're worried about foreigners grabbing land in Brazil, it's still way by far the gringos and the Western Europeans. Even if you look at soy specifically. So where does that come from? You know, I argue that actually there's a long history of xenophobia, of fear of the Chinese. That first they were an inferior race that would have maybe been brought in to replace African slaves, but then they would have contaminated the whitening of the Brazilian race. And during the Cold War, they were basically treated as these, scary communist, politically motivated people that were going to do revolution in Brazil. And these guys were actually formally, legally invited by the Brazilian government. And then the military took over and immediately arrested them, accused them of being terrorists, and that their acupuncture needles and traditional Chinese medicine were tools for assassination. It's true. Those guys spent a year in military prison, and they were the main justification that the military used to say, look, communists are trying to take over the country. So because of this whole history, you really have a whole story of fear of Asian timber companies coming to buy up the Amazon and deforest it. And during the 2000s, you have a fear of cheap Chinese manufacturing invading our markets. So all of these fears of Chinese invasion then got translated into the land grab story. And 1 minute?
1 minute. One more.
The reason why, there were attempts to invest. This company tried to get 200,000 hectares in Brazil. They got this huge farm, a couple of smaller ones, but they really could not put it into production. And it was not only because they were not very capable of doing it, they got a lot of political support to do it, but there was a lot of resistance to it. They tried to set up a factory right across from one of those landless peasant movement camps, and very quickly, by 2015, that movement had organized nationally to occupy those farms and expose them as illegal. Because of this fear of Chinese land grabs, they created restrictions on Chinese investments, on foreign investments, but specifically targeting the Chinese. Meanwhile, a lot of Chinese investments actually went in, like this guy is showing, into places like that. The bulk of Chinese investments in Brazilian agribusiness are in ports managed by white guys like these, who have been working in Brazilian and global agribusiness for a while, operating huge amounts of warehouses and ports facilities, but really focusing on things like this, waterways, port infrastructures. This one I went to see in 2015, it's already operational. So it's not that it's a better way that they're investing in these infrastructures instead of grabbing land. The way that they get that infrastructure is largely by relying on Brazilian partners who are able to, like in the case of these ports, build them by going around a lot of the environmental restrictions. And by relying on Brazilian agribusiness folks, they have the expertise to avoid causing a lot of the conflict, to avoid exposing themselves to conflict, the way that the company that tried to get the farmland got exposed and got occupied by the MST. So what I've done today, and this is my conclusion, just to tell them what happened. Here's what happened, folks. You got a little taste of global political ecology and critical geopolitics, and you got a very basic understanding about soy and globalization, especially those of you that actually read the paper. And then I focused on this first argument, that Brazil-China trade does not rest in comparative advantage based on natural conditions, but on a politically constructed, and by the way, very unjust and unsustainable social ecology. And I went way too fast but it kind of gave you a sense of another argument that China is not actually a leading land grabber in Brazil. It's actually part of a xenophobic imaginary, and it's also a result of Brazilian resistance to Chinese attempts to grab land. But if you do want to understand where a lot of Chinese capital is going, you've got to look at infrastructure. A lot of the Idailu, China's Belt and Road Initiative stuff gets into that story, and that's my next book. So thank you all very much. I really look forward to hearing your questions.